Thank you, Tyler. And just want to give pre-thank you to Tyler back there, who I've worked with innumerable times, who's always held it down, so thank you, Tyler 1. Welcome all to the Fold of the Righteous, which is the final event of the KYLYN API Arts and Culture Festival. Once again, I want to just again thank the library for being such a amazing supporter for all the programming. These are literally the last 2 copies of the poster, so they're now officially collectible. I saw them listed on eBay. I did not see them listed on eBay, but these are the last 2 posters. So if you want one, please take one. And I think I handed out all the last shiny stickers. But thank you again all for coming. This panel discussion was intentionally the last program because of the topic, which is intersectional solidarity. And it was really key for me to have 3 people on this panel who I think are much smarter and have great things to say about it. So, I want to introduce, we'll start at the end. Started with, I don't have your bios in front of me, but we're gonna freestyle this.
Yes.
This is the last event, it's freestyle.
Or we can introduce ourselves.
Oh, that's even better. Okay, we'll do that's even better. We'll go with it. And hello, live stream audience. Hello, live stream audience. But yes, Manan, please, before I ruin your CV.
No, not at all. I just wanted to take some pressure off you. My name is Manan Desai. I'm an associate professor in the Department of American Culture here at the University of Michigan, and I also, I guess I'm gonna be the director in a couple days again of the director of the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program. So yeah. Oh, it's not so much a congrats thing. It's getting back to work. So, but thank you. Yeah, good luck. It's a good luck thing.
Hey.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and that's all I have to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Lily Chen. I am actually a second year student in the Department of American Culture, where Manan will have to take on the mantle. And then I also am an assistant curator at the Detroit Historical Society, and I work on also historical markers for the state of Michigan, and a couple other things. So I'm so happy to be here.
I'm Praveena Ramaswami. I am a community leader and advocate in Ann Arbor.
Press the button on your microphone.
I feel like I'm in a debate.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. I'm Praveena Ramaswamy. I am a community leader and advocate here in town. My day job is, communications marketing, but what I really love is my community and organizing events, bringing people together, bringing awareness to communications to people who just need a place to get information. So that's me.
Yeah, before we get started, I do want to just extend a thank you to the 3 of you for all the work that you do for the communities, for Ann Arbor and beyond. They all do extraordinary work. If you look up their CVs, highly impressive. But let's get to the topic at hand. We will start, I'll actually start with a quick introduction of why this title, The Fold of the Righteous. It comes from a quote from Audre Lorde, who was brought up yesterday at a panel that Lily moderated. The actual full quote is this, quote, "What woman's terms of oppression have become precious and necessary to her as a ticket into the fold of the righteous, away from the cold winds of self-scrutiny. We welcome all women who can meet us face to face beyond objectification and beyond guilt." So for me, the fold of the righteous is tied deeply with the second part of that sentence, which is the cold winds of self-scrutiny. And that is, I think, any movement, any community-based movement, API movement, needs to have a lot of scrutiny, of self-reflection about what we're doing. But the cold winds of self-scrutiny is not as good of a title for a panel discussion. That is, less appealing, fold of the righteous. But it's like, if we do want to become that, if we do want to to really take that kind of moral stand as a community, as activists, as organizers, we have to recognize that self-reflection is, a key part of it. And for me, so much of what's happening in the world right now is tied to, intersectional solidarity. And I think it's important for us as organizers and activists to kind of reflect on how we engage with that, which I think, successfully embracing that solidarity is the necessary future for our growth. But how do we get there? And how do we sustain it? And what does it even look like, Praveena? But really, the first question I have for the three of you is, what does intersectionality mean to you? Why do you feel that it's important to AAPI communities, and specifically, potentially, in Metro Detroit? Manan, we'll start with you, because you're at the end.
You sure you want to start with me?
Or for Lily and Praveena. We'll keep it loose. It's the last event.
I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yes, of course, because of course we're talking about intersectionality, but also we are sitting on lands that were colonized, right, and were stolen from indigenous people. So today we sit on the lands of the Anishinaabe, who have been here since time immemorial, and they are still thriving and living in Michigan. We have the Bodowanmi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa, and also some other groups as well, right here in Ann Arbor. I think we also pay tribute to the Wendat, and these are thriving communities. We actually have Anishinaabe-Moan classes in our department, so it's beautiful to be on this land and also to go far beyond a land acknowledgement and to make Indigenous solidarity part of our everyday work. And then I also want to, in addition to the land acknowledgement, honor that right today, it's still ongoing, is the occupation and genocide of people in Palestine. And yes. Okay, go for it.
Okay. So thank you for that. I mean, I think that's really important. It's a difficult question. What is intersectionality? I think it's a really important conceptual analytical term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw within the traditions of Black feminism, and it's been taken up in a lot of different spaces, academic spaces, activist spaces. But I think one of the ways to think about it it's hard to define it without using the term itself, but thinking about the intersections of oppression that shape communities and shape how communities move through the world. So I teach in the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program. One of the things and I teach the intro course, and one of the things we think about very early on, the first day, is what does it mean? What does it actually mean to call a course Asian Pacific Islander American, right? Because that's a tangle, this logo of a lot of different positions, identities, and histories. And I think the very definition of Asian American, we could say, kind of comes out of a political solidarity movement, like a student movement. Although the term Asian American comes out of that. That's not to say there weren't political coalitions before that, they just didn't coin themselves that way. I think so intersectionality is so kind of embedded in the idea of Asian American. Even the term Asian Pacific Islander American, I don't know this history as much as other people in my department, but that was a really conscientious choice. There's a slash between Asian and Pacific Islander because those communities, while they kind of initially the term comes together almost in a kind of census demographic way that has to do with the statehood of Hawaii, they're really different communities with very different histories and often conflicting histories, right? I don't want to say too much more about that, or we can kind of pick that up in the conversation, but I think that's one of the things that's important. So I don't think I've actually answered, Chen, your question, but just to think about Asian American itself it's a fiction, right? There's nothing, of course you can say there are shared history, there are moments of intersecting histories, but in and of itself, it was another kind of academic term, strategic essentialism, that was used to build power, build coalition in order to kind of fight against different sort of forms of oppression. So I think intersections, solidarities, coalitions, these are similar but different terms, but I think they're really useful when you're thinking about history and activism and imagining new forms of coalition and community. So, yeah.
Cool.
Lily?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about kind of the things that you're talking about with what, how complicated what API, NHPI, what these kinds of things mean, because of course we're spanning immigrants, refugees, non-immigrants, indigenous people, right? There's a huge range. When I think about calling back to Kimberly Crenshaw, this was, of course, intersectionality was a legal term, right? So originally we're talking about literally the federal law that does not recognize, was not able to recognize how a crime against a black woman had to be either a crime that was against her blackness or against her womanhood, right? And could not be both. And in reality, that's still the case today. Both the legal system and in our lived experience, we have very little ways to understand how you can both occupy all those spaces and that they actually both influence each other and make an entirely new thing. I think sometimes intersectionality, as we know, kind of gets used in strange ways where now it becomes this backpack term where people are like, well, I have this and I have this and I have this. And in reality, what it originally is a structural critique, right? And it's not necessarily a critique of individual experience, but actually this kind of look at what are the failures of the structures that we live in today that fail to account for our lives, and particular lives that are sitting at the intersection of all these different structures that fail, right, that continue to fail us, and they continue to fail us today. And I think about that in relation to lived experience because often it's women of color and Black women that lead us that are able to recognize, because we are women of color, that our solidarities have to extend far beyond simply our ethnic identities or our racial identities or our gender identities, that the people that I find community with can't just be Asian American, right? There is actually far more that goes that matters in my own lived experience, and that's because of those structural realities. So I think not losing that structure is really important, and also honoring the fact that living at the intersection of these structures does actually put you in communication and in solidarity with other people who do as well.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the word intersectionality for me means bringing people together, and my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, moved here in the 1960s, maybe even 50s, but regardless, started a very subset Indian community in Metro Detroit, which still is the legacy today. It's quite large now, but what we see in a lot of communities, especially in the Asian communities, is organizing by your community, where you're from. And in the Indian community, it's even more like you're from this state, right? The people from this state, or even religion. It's all compartmentalized, and that was a way for people to find their people, especially back in the day. That's how you found your people. You built your community because it was common language, common culture, common food. However, and when I think about solidarity, I grew up in Northern Canada, and at that time, you could probably count the people of color with your hands. I mean, I remember in school, it was not very diverse. However, when I'm hearing you speak, kind of reminded me of something I worked on here in Ann Arbor, when Asian hate became, when all those incidents happened a few years ago. A friend of myself and a friend organized a Zoom call because it was still during the pandemic, and we put out a notice to say if people are feeling, because there's not a common organization. Maybe now there's more organizations for AAPI, but there wasn't anything for parents, and parents didn't know where to get information, what to do, how to talk to their kids about what was happening, and I don't even think conversations have ever even existed, right? Especially from a cultural standpoint, you don't talk about these. I was always taught, someone says something, you deal, you move on, and don't act like anything happened, because that's your survival skill. So we had a Zoom call, and the amount of crying and sadness in this call of people saying that their child is going through at school, not able to bring lunches, being made fun of, just reminded all of us, everybody just felt it like, oh my God, this is a lived experience of so many people. And what we did as Solidarity is we realized there is really no representation of a common group in the public school system to represent those parents. And a lot of those parents, English was a second language, and they didn't know how to advocate for themselves. Also, again, culturally, it's like, don't get the teacher mad, don't make your kid school sound, there was a lot of interesting conversations. So we started the AAPISA, which we extended it even further, because people were like, well, how about the South Asians, and how about the Americans? And there was a lot of conversations. But in the end, we decided, as Solidarity, we would come together and form a committee with Ann Arbor Public Schools for parents to have a resource, for students to have a place, and for APS to come to us to ask the questions. To, for a lot of the other students, communities, they have action plans of how to deal from a DEI perspective if somebody says something that's racist, but they were not really aware of the Asian culture, and we realized, what is the Asian culture? That is a grouped thing, a South Indian versus a North Indian versus someone from Taiwan versus someone from Japan. We're all grouped as Asian, but it's all kinds of different Asians, right? But I think in the end, we all recognize that we have to come together. That was a moment of solidarity, and I'm no longer with the organization, but that still continues to live. It is part of now the board. PS board now has that as a committee where they go and work with. It could be stronger, there could be more of a presence, but it's a start. I think what I'm trying to say is there's lots of gaps, and I think we all need to come together to have a voice, right? Like, we also have, there's also racism and things that we go through that I don't think we talk about enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, interestingly, Lily, you're talking about like kind of the structuralism, right? And like my parents were the same. I think for new immigrants, so many of their generations, a lot of the same experience where they come here, and you do want to find people who speak the same language, and that is a very natural, almost holistic kind of processes. What I think, like, what ends up happening sometimes, where I think there is danger, is that like that kind of manifests and transforms into almost a buy-in of like self-siloing and that like becoming part of the structure, right? And that is, I think, like what you're talking about, Praveena, what can liberate us from that. And it's unfortunate. I mean, it's great that it exists. It's unfortunate it has to come from such a moment of like severe trauma.
Right.
And I think part of, I think in all the work we do is I would encourage all of us to just try to find pathways of coalition building that's not dependent on trauma as the catalyst, because, I've had some fairly disturbing meetings with certain people in certain organizations where I realized that that the self-siloing is how intentional it is. And I don't think I try to communicate, but I don't think I'm always effective in communicating why that's damaging in the long term.
Yeah.
Especially in Metro Detroit, I think like we're at a real moment now where if Detroit is coming, it's continually coming back. Like, what is the role of AAPI communities, like getting involved? And like, how do we align with Indigenous? How do we align with the queer communities? How do we align with the Black and Latinx communities? How do we do this?
Right.
And how do we do it right in a way that isn't performative and really performative?
Yes.
Because I have seen it, and it sucks.
Yeah.
It's so I think
It's the comfortable piece, right? But
it is.
Yeah.
It is. It's very much that, and I think like that. When you realize that it's almost like people have been coasting on that piece, and it's like there has to be something under to support it, or it's not. It has a limit. There are limits. So I think like that's my next question to you all. But what do you see as the main obstacles of achieving, like true, solidarity amongst like all, amongst all throughout all communities.
Well, I don't know. Some of the stuff you were saying was amazing. I wanted to respond to it, if that's okay.
Oh,
Both
please,
of you.
please, yes, yeah.
I think, I have so many thoughts, but I do want to turn actually to the original essay that inspired this. Oh, okay, I dropped my phone, sorry. Because it is so much guidance. Audre Lorde was writing and thinking more than 40 years ago now, which is crazy because we still have so much to learn from her. But I wanted to read from the original essay that you had read from, because I think there's a lot that we can take away. And she says,
this whole thing could have been about Audre. It could have just been the wisdom of Audre Lorde.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But in exactly this paragraph, she says, "What woman here is so enamored of her own oppression that she cannot see her heel print upon another woman's face? What woman's terms of oppression have become precious and necessary to her as a ticket into the fold of the righteous, away from the cold winds of self-scrutiny?" So, what we're talking about here is this problem where, and I do want to honor, so many of our communities came here and did silo because they needed to, right?
Yes.
So we need to recognize that we're in Detroit, right? If you're talking about, for example, the Chinese community that arrived over 150 years ago, we're talking like 1870s. This is a terrible place to be if you are Asian, right? And so of course you're building these silos. I will say that silo looks so different from the silos that we have today. And I think part of the huge reason of that is class, right? And I think you can see the ways in which Chinatowns or these ethnic communities that were poor, right, functioned very differently than the way that ethnic communities function today, which is often about achieving, right, the model minority status that the API community is always going for. Instead, those communities, for example, still in today's, like Chicago's Chinatowns, right, where people are far below the median income, people are far more willing to build coalition, right, across lines of difference. I think that's something that Audre Lorde brings to us, which is that on the one hand, we can talk about organizing solidarities across people that we feel the same things with, right? That, okay, we all drink bubble tea and we all, right, all these kinds of things. But actually there's a different way of organizing, which is about coalition, as you were talking about, which is building coalition across lines of difference. If someone else experiences oppression in a completely different way from me, can I have that empathy to be able to actually still build that coalition with them? And we see examples of that in Detroit, in Detroit's history, in contemporary Detroit. That's why I'm so proud to be like working in the city of Detroit. And I feel like there's so much that comes out of being able to say, hey, you have a completely different life than me, and I'm still going to recognize that I can empathize with you. Yeah. Well, okay, sorry. I'm gonna give a very
No, but it's something I think you
great.
just have to
Yeah.
kind of sit with words, and it's I think like Detroit, it's interesting. I'm on the this is not a fact. This is just a fact, but I'm on the board of a museum in the Chicago Chinatown, and I found like the openness to like bring in all kinds of different stories is so different than what I've experienced here.
Yep.
Which I found, to be honest, surprising.
Different meaning like more accepting?
More
or-
accepting.
Yeah.
More,
In Chicago or
in
here?
Chicago.
Huh.
More accepting. And not that there aren't obstacles and challenges, along the way. And there are always going to be people who are long-term, like, stalwarts within the community who are less okay with change, but the fact that the change is happening, and I think is extraordinary. And I think that's kind of where the future of the API communities, I think in Metro Detroit, I think the class issue is has created like this self-created barrier.
Yep, absolutely.
And I do, but like those are kind of the things of like, when I've had problematic, which is a nice way of putting it, conversations in the past with certain people, organizations of API organizations, I find that the inability to discern between class and kind of racist is,
Do you think it's a generational? I mean, you have, hearing from our voices, maybe I'm gonna assume we're all second generation or I guess first
Yeah.
generation that came here, right? And like you said, our parents were the immigrants and they were together, and I don't think my parents or any of my family would
Yeah.
have conversations that we're having. They're seeing it in a very different perspective. So that's maybe why we're not as organized or supportive
It's
of
about
it.
half and half, actually. Like
Yeah.
I think some people actually I was really surprised by. But I think but part of I think where I feel like I dropped the ball is not pursuing it within that discussion. Because I think it's like as any normal human being when you're engaged with these kind of topics, there's like a shock. When you have that, when someone says something that is, I think, runs antithetically to the values of the organization they represent. I like that, like you kind of don't know what to do with it in the moment. And, part of kind of the hopes for even any of the programming for KYLYN is kind of like hopefully providing people with like a toolbox of like how to almost navigate those moments, but have thoughts to kind of like for lack of a better term, like Batman's utility belt, like having on you, when you're in conversation to like be able to respond and help people in the moment instead of like what just happening, like just thinking what just happened all the way to my car and I'm driving home and then I'm like, wait, I should have said, why didn't I say this? Or why didn't I bring up this? Because I feel like I know what the core issues are, but why am I unable to kind of synthesize those ideas within that moment when it matters, like kind of it matters,
Well, I want to speak to the generational thing.
Yeah.
Because I think that when I was growing up, I really was like, oh, second generation is where it's at, right? And it's like first generation, they're the problem. And it took me years to then like essentially spend lots of time talking to second and third generation immigrants, and then also talking with first generation, realizing, oh no, we're also the problem. We're also the problem. And actually, like I so don't want to discount how much value the first generation brings, because so many of these people are the original indigenous inhabitants of wherever they're coming from, or they are the ones seeking refugee status or asylum status. They are the ones that have suffered far more than I can ever understand. And often when I think of the problem between the first and second generation, I think it comes back to class. I think that you often have first generation immigrants that are poor, right? Poorer than the second generation. And because they experience that level of poverty, they actually have an ability to empathize far beyond what I can, right? And I always feel very impressed by that I can, I mean, specifically in the Chinese context, like there are Chinese immigrants that, I mean, were part of the CCP, right, that are here today. And so it's like there are far more progressive and leftist people that are part of different generations. It just depends on the kind of access to capital. I think access to capital can really turn you, right? And you get a kind of different.
I don't think it can. I think it does.
Yes, and
it's impossible to escape the, like, I was just talking the other day, what does Chen look like outside of capitalism?
Right.
And I was like, who am I outside? It's like, I don't even know.
Yeah.
It's like it permeates all aspects of your life.
I know. I mean, when I think about the Chicago question and the reason why I find Chicago to be such a radical space for Asian Americans, it is actually because the structure of the city of Chicago is such that the people of color were forced to live on the south side of the city and white people were living on the north side of the city. This was like so rigidly defined that when a young black child tried to cross, not purposely, but was swimming in the river, he was violently assaulted. So, and where is Chinatown in Chicago? It's on the south side, right? It is where Mexican Town is. It is where Pilsen and Little Village and all of Black Chicago is too. So in that environment, you have all of these Asian Americans in coalition with other communities of color because they are experiencing poverty. I think that's a really clear way that intersectionality influences the way that we're able to empathize. But I also wanted to come back. We were talking about getting kind of stuck in community and in sameness, I think there are some very practical examples that we can bring up in the contemporary moment. Of course, one is Palestine. And I think we make a grave, grave error when Asian Americans, and this is not all Asian Americans because there are many, many Asian Americans like Manan here who have never wavered, right, on their like solidarity with Palestine. But one of the coolest things that I've seen, the Wing Luke Museum, which is in Seattle's International District. This is a very, very progressive museum. It is a museum dedicated to Asian American lives. Recently, they had a walkout because the workers were protesting an exhibit that was essentially in support of Israel. And in the debate for this exhibit, there was this kind of question of whether Asian America needs to take a stance on Palestine. Does it matter to us? What are the consequences, right? And this, I think, reminded me of a similar thing that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement, which is like, well, if it's not us, doesn't matter, right? If it's not us, doesn't matter. And I think there are different ways. We've seen from the Wing Luke response, some people have said, well, they are us, right? Palestine is West Asia, we're Asian Americans, therefore we need to stand with our brothers and sisters. My question is always, what if they're not us, right? What if we are not them at all? Can we still stand with them? Like, can we still actually say, hey, we do not support settler colonialism, we do not support genocide, and we do not support ethnic cleansing, right? And we don't support the forced displacement of people because we've experienced it, but not because we've experienced it the same way that you have. And so it comes back, I think, to this, like, what does it mean to truly build empathy? Because empathy is a big challenge. Empathy isn't like, oh, you and I see the same, and so we are the same. It's actually you and I are different, but I still love you. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, this is a really great conversation. I'm thinking about, a lot of ways, my experiences, because I'm so entrenched at the university at this point, like a lot of what I see is what unfolds on our campuses. And I mean, I'm constantly reminded, I was thinking about the ways that one can kind of retreat into, and I think retreat is the key word, retreat into a certain class position, retreat into a certain kind of ethnic identity or whatever it is, right? In which it's sort of safer there, or it can be safer depending on what your position is, right? Your social position. And I mean, I can feel that getting older, like having more access to capital, being a professor, being a tenured professor, all of these ways in which, I could just kind of hang back. And I feel like for me, most of my interaction with, I'm not a community activist, I'm really an academic, and I'm at the university, but I'm constantly challenged by young students who are dissatisfied with those kind of, that kind of retreat. And I think I've been teaching as a professor long enough to see, just the robustness of this kind of, the powerful kind of political imagination of young people. It's not just students, obviously, right? But that's I interact with college students the most. And so, on our campus, one of the most powerful examples of solidarity and coalition that I saw were all of the student organizations who, connected around this issue of Palestine as a way to protect who they saw as the most vulnerable, right? Palestinian students against the campus, against the kind of university and the administrative response. So some of that was about, maybe it was about imagining oneself in another person's shoes, but it was also a kind of tactical decision to say, look, it's all of us. I mean, you see that on during the encampments too, where it was very powerful to see, Jewish students, anti-Zionist Jewish students who vocally said that, right, as a way of kind of protecting really vulnerable students. And it's kind of happening. It's also vulnerable faculty too. So, I mean, I never want to front and say that I'm more than I'm not. So that's why I'm saying, I'm really not an activist. But I'm constantly pushed and challenged by a younger generation of students, sometimes in ways that I don't want to, but I know it's good for me, I was thinking too, I mean, I'm sorry to bring it back to the classroom, but there, when I was first teaching those large Asian American lecture courses, I didn't think about, it was almost like my approach to it was Asian Americans matter and this is the reason why. And that's really changed. And I think it was from the pressure of students, which is like, no, let's think about things structurally. This is the history of the United States. This is the ways in which the metaphor that works for me is like, these are the different sort of racial scripts that animate the nation. And so it's like settler colonialism, anti-blackness, the history of slavery, the history of immigration. And so that's like one of the ways that I'm saying this because it was really because my students were not interested in a kind of like celebratory Asian American. Maybe there were moments my third semester I just wanted to kind of phone it in. They're like, no, you can't phone it in. This is too important. This is too important. So I'm always kind of want to throw some light on young people and the power of their political imagination.
Well, I just want to say to you that you may not identify yourself as an activist, but that is a forum of having conversations and being open to new perspectives and voice, especially from another generation that maybe you didn't relate to how they see the world today. That's a forum. So you may not be on the streets organizing, but it's a way to have open dialogue. And my generation, that was not a thing. The activism generation, I feel like there was a gap. I'm a child of the 90s, and that was not a thing when I was in high school. We're probably the same age, right?
We're the same, and I think part of so much of my drive now is because I like to get to a kind of a tangent about our generation of just how we grew up, is that there was so much political awareness, but not a lot of political action coming from, there was this kind of sense of like things had been settled and solved, and the rise of, I constantly bring up the rise of postmodernism. You can only have that if you think everything is kind of sorted. And why it leaves that entire time period of postmodernism leaves such kind of, I think, a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, is because it was all under the, it was just a house of cards. It just kind of fell. And
well, it's also how we received information, right? I mean,
true.
We were like, the wall's coming down.
Yeah. And
in Germany. I mean, like we got little pieces, but I mean, I have teenage daughters, and when Black Lives Matter happened, it was almost like a moment of like, I think for them it was, seeing news that they were getting from their phone versus what I was seeing on the media, because I'm old and I watch the news, and they're looking at their news and they're seeing videos, and the conversations was so amazing to me to hear them having this dialogue with me. And it was almost like we were arguing, because I come from a different generation, even though I feel like I'm woke, but I'm nowhere near this next generation of these questioning, like you're saying your students are like, when I went to school, teacher said something, you're like, and then you like write it down and you move forward. There was not this challenge dialogue, and it's really great that it's happening. That they're like, no, that's not what I saw, and I don't agree with you. It gives me hope for the future. What will be if we're this old generation going, okay, we can organize because we have the means, we have the financial ability, we can organize this. We're not students who are living off ramen.
It's like on one hand, I think the one lesson that Gen X really has to have learned is that we can't be complacent ever, and I think that's part of the thing, is that you always have to be in it, and it's exhausting. Activism is exhausting, organizing is exhausting, and but how do you do it? How do you sustain it? How do you not burn out? How do you make sure that the people within your community don't burn out, right? And those are the kind of strategies that I think are important for us to think about and develop, because for me, there's the 90s to like the right up until 9/11 just felt like not blinders, but just that it was
Everything's hunky-dory.
Everything's hunky-dory. Like, if something bad happens, I'll be there to like fight against it. But in the meantime, and I think like there are cool parts of like postmodernism, I think, with a lot of like with music and everything, but I think a lot of it was very like the level of irony and the way that the vulnerable populations were had to endure all that has long-standing damage. And part of, I think, one thing, Manan, that you're talking about, which I think is really key, is that a lot of people in your position would give into a kind of fear. And your openness to engage with the students really does speak to what Praveena's talking about, is like, in my mind, one of the main obstacles to true solidarity is fear of it's not the opposite of empathy, but it is like the gray barrier of when people don't even recognize that they're afraid, that they're afraid to change or afraid to engage or afraid to learn, that there's a certain point that you feel like, I got a handle on it. And I think for me, it's just this constant thing of I don't have a handle on anything. It's like, it's just like everything's evolving, and the new generations, we all need to learn to work and communicate and work with each other and not give into that fear. And it's a weird thing to say, how do we weaponize empathy? Which is not the word I want to use, but that is what popped in my mind.
Yeah.
But how do we, how do we make empathy the primary tool? How do we toolify it? That's not even English at this point.
I want to.
But yeah. Toolify? Oh.
Oh yes, of course, yeah. I actually, to that point, I want to come back to what Manan was saying about this kind of initial good immigrant phenomenon, right? Which I work in the museum world, and in ethnic museums, this is the driving force, which is to essentially prove, especially since 9/11, to prove that we don't deserve to die. So I think there is, the question of fear and the affect of fear is so powerful, and it's not made up. There are people, we are under harm. I think what happens, and that's very dangerous, is that when you know, hey, I could be harmed, it's very hard to then turn and say, who else could be harmed, right? Or who am I harming? Because I never want to erase the fact, the reason that good immigrant museums exist, right? And this is referring to one of my favorite museums that exists is the Arab American National Museum. It is in Dearborn. It's here in Dearborn. It is a Smithsonian level museum, but it's here in Dearborn because this is the densest Arab population, right, outside of any Arab country. So this is an incredible institution. But and the director is my mentor, and one of the conversations we always have is, hey, this is a good immigrant museum. What does that mean? It means that the purpose of the museum is to prove that we are not terrorists, we don't deserve to die, here are the contributions we made to American society, please don't kill us.
That's like a t-shirt. A t-shirt nobody should wear, but...
And the thing is, that's true. So I want to honor the fact that people actually do feel that threat, and it is very real. At the same time, can we both understand ourselves as living in an existence that is under threat, right? We are potentially always being harmed, and at the same time, we are capable of doing harm ourselves. And if we are not paying attention to the harm that we are doing, we are only perpetuating the very same problem. This is the Audre Lorde thing, right? This is the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, because we cannot take the tools of white supremacy, right, to then inflict it on others. And one of the ways we do that is through, the Stop Asian Hate movement is a very, very complicated world, because you have Asian Americans who are very, very afraid and legitimately afraid. And let's not, rightfully. Yeah. My car was keyed, I was egged, I got threatened with a gun, all sorts of stuff happened, right? And they're rightfully afraid, but then what happens is it becomes, okay, our lives matter too, right? And you get this movement where, okay, we're so afraid, it has to be about us. And we then completely fail to see the ways in which, oh wait, if we increase policing, right? If we have this Stop Asian Hate legislation, more people are being incarcerated, right? More police, more incarceration, more death penalty, right? And whose communities does that harm, right? And it's certainly, right? There are certain communities.
I'm going to tell you guys about one of the most traumatic meetings I ever had, which was a couple. Okay, I'm going to do it without naming names. I'm going to do it without naming names.
Don't name names. This is being recorded.
Okay, this is being live streamed. So basically, an organization that I was helping out at the time She knows this story because I think I immediately reached out that it was a coalition meeting, right, about like discrimination, and everyone was on board. All these different organizations that we all know were on board, and the featured guests were all law enforcement, and the featured speaker was from Homeland Security. And I sat through this thing with the level of cognitive dissonance that I just could not understand what was happening, because the person who from Homeland Security was just talking about like, oh yeah, all our numbers are great and all that, and I was like, what is happening? Like, we're talking about
Humans.
how to band together to work against discrimination, hatred, and this is who we're like. This is our featured like I just obviously it's been like 3 years and I still can't process this meeting. That speaker, the featured Homeland Security guy, by the way, arrested for corruption by the FBI last year.
That's karma.
That is karma, but
Why was he invited? Who invited him, and what
because
reasoning?
it goes to what Lily's talking about, that belief that if we buy into the structure and align with these that align with policing and increasing polices, that we will be protected. And a lot of the leaders within, and this was like a diverse group of leaders from all, there was Latinx, it was horrible. And they're all just like saying, hey, please police our neighborhoods more because we need it. And I was going like, what is happening? Because the featured speakers literally talking about putting people of color, putting people of color in prison.
Yeah.
And and I'm like, I don't understand this. And I just realized that it's so ingrained, these kind of structural belief systems.
So what they were promoting that, but then maybe the people in the room were like, but we're to her point,
the good immigrants.
we're the good immigrants.
That's what the purpose was.
We're the good
And,
people.
yeah.
We're not like the other people. Please
Yes.
protect us. And
Yes, that's exactly what it was. And it was, for me, a nightmare, because I understand, to this day, I understand the reasoning, but how it was executed and the self-silencing and the lack of questioning engagement to the people who were invited to talk was, I thought, beyond problematic. I mean, for me, obviously, it's been 2-3 years traumatizing.
Yeah.
Of just I thought we just had a conversation about what's happening, and I think that's the part of with you, if you have solidarity and you align, but you align under the umbrella of structural oppression, that's not a win.
Right.
That's not a win. That's that you're going back, and you're really, that's what I mean. That's the fear winning. You're.
I was going to ask Manan, you had mentioned that you feel like now that you're older, that activism feeling is less. Do you think that what Chen is talking about and what you're talking about could be that as you get older versus being a college student, you have a fear of more to lose, of reputation, job, security, so you have a less likelihood to speak about it, right? Well, if you're a student, you're having this conversation in a classroom or amongst peers. Does that spirit die slowly because of that fear of, especially-
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I was saying that in part because it's sort of, more to lose is one way to frame it. The other is sort of, you've kind of bought into a system that has rewarded you, and so it becomes a little bit more. You face the contradictions a little bit more about. You face that contradiction, and there may be a little bit more fear to challenge it because it has rewarded you. That's where it's kind of to think about that, the first quote that Chen started with, the cold winds of self-scrutiny. I think that's really important in that moment to think, and so I'm speaking kind of individually, but I think communities need to go through that as well. To be a little bit more specific about it, and maybe this is a little bit of a tangent from the question you're asking, Praveena, but because Lily was kind of mentioning museums and history work and that sort of thing. One of the organizations I was involved in was the South Asian American Digital Archive, and that was a kind of like the Arab American National Museum, trying to tell a story and recover histories of South Asian Americans. And it's been really interesting to see how that organization has evolved. And part of it was, I think, I'm a fan. I'm no longer a part of it, but I'm a fan of it in part because it never stopped self-scrutinizing, and part of it was like, okay, even within a blanket community like South Asian American, Praveena, you kind of mentioned this, there's so much diversity within it, and there's so many sort of different hierarchies of oppression that are kind of playing out religion-wise, caste-wise, and so it required a kind of like, it required self-scrutiny and changing a kind of organizational structure to include more voices, and part of that was to accept criticism within and without, to kind of challenge. I think that's my theme, right? Like I think if there's a theme, it's to be open to criticism and then self-reflect and think about, okay, how do you for teaching or for an organization? So that was a pivot away from the question you were asking about, you know, is it about getting old? You are less likely to, I mean, less likely to be involved. But I think it's more of just, I think that spirit of self-scrutiny, you can't let go of that. Otherwise, you know, depending on your subject position, you might be rewarded by a system that is, as Lily's been kind of pointing to, and the whole panel is, that's rewarding one and destroying so many others, right? So.
Right. Yeah. I think like you're speaking to so many things of like, when I think about the self-scrutiny, there's a piece of it that feels like, oh, I'm doing something wrong. I think there's another lens to look at it, which is that it is also an act of love. Because when we think about, for example, who are in the prisons, there are a ton of Asian Americans in prisons. That's just the fact. But those are not the people that we are thinking about or caring about. And that's because, right, they haven't met, like you've said, they haven't met the good immigrant standard. But then an act of love, right, because I often in my work get criticized where it's like, hey, you're Asian American, why don't you just do Asian American stuff? Like, just stick to Asian American stuff. And I think the pushback that I have is, oh, these are also Asian Americans. These just happen to be poor Asian Americans, or gay Asian Americans, or trans Asian Americans, or incarcerated Asian Americans, or Asian Americans who do sex work, right? When I think about, like, I think this kind of speaks to the thing you're talking about, which is like why within community, maybe we can learn from within the community too, right? That there is an opportunity to learn from the fringes. I think like there is a middle, and the middle has access to the middle class, right? And has job security, and you know, has a tenure track job, which is incredible, and I will never achieve. But like when you actually look away from those and look toward the fringes, okay, who are parts of our community who are also Asian Americans, but who are actually really under threat? And can we actually express the same level of love that we have for them then also for the middle class, right? Because the middle class, yes, okay, you've achieved all the markers of success, and everyone else is trying to survive. What can we learn from them? I think specifically about the Georgia shooting, right, the Atlanta shooting, because the Atlanta shooting is such a perfect example of a moment in which Asian America kind of plays itself out, reveals a lot of things about itself, right? Because during the Atlanta shooting is a moment in which these women who were potentially sex workers, we don't know, right, were killed. And in that moment, you saw the rhetoric was, okay, they weren't sex workers, so they didn't deserve to die, or they're Asian American, they didn't deserve to die, et cetera, et cetera. And the question we have to ask is, what if they were sex workers? What if they were like sex workers that were breaking the law and whatever? Did they still deserve to die? And the answer is no, right? And I think our community needs to contend with, hey, our community is made up of a lot of different people, right? And what about those people on the edges? If we care for them, that means we can care for us all. That's like a Black feminist concept, right?
Yeah, and I think that one underlying theme that I think drives a lot of that motivation is shame. Is like of true weaponizing shame within our communities, which would be a whole panel discussion itself.
we
Maybe KYLYN
love-
2025. But,
It's all about shame.
Yeah, a lot of shame-based culture. I mean, like, I think
yes.
anybody in this room can talk about the power of shame, you know, and like shame.
We all were
used-
raised under shame.
Yeah. Oh, I know all about shame. Yeah. Yeah. There's just some key moments before family reunions when my dad turned on, like, you will not talk about X, Y, Z. I was like, won't I? Like, can't talk about that. That's all I want to talk about. Great moment, by the way, is when I was working for Planned Parenthood and, you know, watching my parents tell all my aunties and uncles about what I did for a living. I was like, delight, you know. But I think that's Lily, an excellent thing for us to move on to a Q&A. Do we have time for Q&A? Quick Q&A? One question? Yeah, sure. One. Who
Maybe
wants to be the
two.
one? How about Deuce question? Any questions?
Hello, thank you. You touched on so many points, but I want to talk a little bit about the generational. So I thought that I knew more than my parents and my grandparents, and it's like, I'm gonna assimilate, I'm going to talk, dress, act, socialize, do things in a certain way, get highly educated, and I'm going to succeed, the American dream. And then when I was in my 30s and 40s, I realized I had some of the American dream, but I still wasn't accepted. And then I realized that my grandfather was right. You know, I thought I could do it better than previous generations. I thought I had the inside track. I read the books. I went to the conferences. I did all of that. But in the end, my grandfather was right. So how do you move forward and still keep the wisdom of your forefathers and foremothers?
Okay, I don't have the answer to this, and I'm probably the youngest person on this panel. So, but I just want to shout out, like, I truly believe this. I truly believe that our ancestral knowledge and the generations that came before us hold everything we need. And I think it's very easy as a young person, as a second generation person, to say, oh, I know better than everyone else before me. And what's crazy is, like, they've lived through harder lives. So it's very bold for me to say way harder lives. So it's hilarious for me to be like, I know so much better. I think with age, what I've come to realize, like, is that when I pay attention to all the generations before me, that's actually where my power comes from. But yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I think that's maybe why I personally got interested in doing history and looking into the past, because it was partly about, you know, scrutinizing the past to understand our present, but also, are there lessons that were learned? Were there possibilities? Were there alternative futures that were crushed but were imagined in the past? So I think, yeah, that's a really, I don't know if, it's hard for me to say that my mom and dad were right, or my grandparents were right. I think they were right about certain things that I felt armed with more education and a facility with English or something that I was maybe dismissive of. There is definitely wisdom to learn from them and earlier generations.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a lived experience for a lot of people. When I think about previous generations, you know, I don't know the exact quote, but it's, you know, we are the hope, right? Like, they see us. I know that I've gone farther than my parents could have, and they're very proud. And I'm excited to see what my offspring will do, and so forth. But I think that there's always that, you have to remember the back of your head, right? Like, we have a little bit of advantage. I know my parents were immigrants. They had an accent. They had a bigger time to climb, and especially in a climate where I lived, which was not very diverse. being able to speak the way that I speak gives me a slight advantage, and I've gone a little bit further. But I think what you're saying is right, is that it's not all rosy. You got to take those glasses off, that there is a reality, and I have faced them many times in the workplace, and I don't want to think that's true, but I sometimes will overcompensate to look as Western as possible and to be as, I never really talked about my culture or my background until maybe more recently, because it became more acceptable and we could have this conversation, but I never grew up in that light. You just had to assimilate, you to look like, and that's, I think, one of the things is why parents would be like, somebody says something to you, don't bring any, just play nice, do your thing, is because it was a survival instinct. They wanted you to do better, and that was the form of doing better, is just push through it. And
I think the fact that we can have this conversation at all, I think, as openly as I feel that we have, is because we're, at the end of the day, you know, the U.S. is still the grand experiment, right? Like, we're the grand social cultural experiment that, like, in most countries, you wouldn't have this panel. Like, you wouldn't have the kind of diversity of, and I think that's a gift, but it's also our great challenge, is absolutely the baseline lessons taught to me, like, throughout my family, those are the things I hold. You know, those are my moral compass. But then, you know, actually pointing back to a workshop, the last KYLYN workshop, they're also stories. They're also stories and narratives. And it's important for us to recognize what, like, we take with us, but also what are constructs to kind of just become, like, kind of guides for us. And I think that's like if, for us to navigate this world, and especially to teach the new generations, like my kids, the hardest thing is, like, what message do I impart on them? Not that, like, everything's a mess, and not that I haven't said that. Like, everything's awful, and then it's just like, wait, must try to, and then I'm just, yeah.
it's a perspective, right?
It's a perspective. It's a perspective, and it's like a perspective of, like, how do we survive, but then how do we thrive and grow? And I think there are no answers, like, no clear answers. If any of us had the answers, that'd be, you know, a wonderful thing. But there's only just strategies and, you know, kind of lessons that we can kind of take with us and impart on future generations. And it's the best I can do, like, you know, on a daily basis, you know, like, long-term thinking, you know, it's important for me to, you know, to bring us all, you know, to bring this together, because I think, like, this is well, one, give it up for the three panelists, for, you know, like, and this is why they're the perfect choice, because to have a thoughtful, meaningful, like, deep conversation about this isn't easy, because it's not an easy topic. And if any of you are leaving more confused than when you came in, I'm sorry. But these are complex topics.
Time to reflect.
Yes, reflection time, yeah. But I'll treat it like a debate. Any parting words of
No.
wisdom?
Thank you for having this discussion.
Yeah.
This is a form of solidarity.
Oh, yes, Lori.
Lori.
Yes. Tyler too. But,
Tyler in his own right.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So it was hard to think of how to respond to all of this, because it's quite rich and it's just beginning to tap the surface. And I'm so impressed by the representation, because I think that you gave us a true sense of an academic. And Lily, you're just great.
I call her the
in your
future.
youth
That's my
and
nickname
in your wisdom. And Praveena, you're so practical and on the ground and connected to the community. And Chen, you are truly ambiguous.
I think the term is hot mess. That's what the people
But
say now, yeah.
the thing that comes up for me, and I'm grateful for, is touching on the generations. And I'm third generation, and I think that in my experience, so much is unsaid between generations. And I'm not sure that it's limited to any particular group. I think it's universal, especially when there's pain and suffering and a sparing of the next generation. And then there's also the tremendous societal pressure to sacrifice and move your children forward and protect them. So all of those forces have us in this pressure cooker, and it's really so inspiring that we can have a forum like this, that we can reference an elder like Audre Lorde, and that we can share more of our individual experiences. So thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Lori.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
you know,
Thank you.
Wait,
again,
I have to shout you out. I have to shout you out.
Do I owe
I
you
promise.
money?
I promise to do this. This is the very last KYLYN event.
it is. Yeah.
KYLYN is something that Chin dreamed of and organized and fundraised and did every single thing for it, named it, and and it's incredible because it's so hard to dream of things and then to make them come into reality. But this is something we're sitting here. We're doing the thing that you dreamed of.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
And I
you.
really just want to thank you and commend you. And you're someone who is dreaming of a better world. This is the thing. As a person with no kids, I like to think that, like, my advice for having kids, because I obviously have the ability to give that advice, is that, like, you're not only trying to protect your kids and build that safe world, you're actually trying to build the world that your kids can flourish in, not just feel safe in, right? That they need to actually be able to grow roots and do everything they need to do. And I'm so impressed by you. So thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot, really, coming from you. Yeah, and I want to thank you all, like, for coming and supporting this. Again, this would not be possible without the library, because I think the library is, you know, their openness to this kind of programming and is extraordinary, and that it's open to the public and everything is free is, like, it matters. You know,
Well,
and
this
like,
is the library is more than just books. This
Yes.
is a community space where we can gather.
It's a library, a cultural center, a community space. It's
So many
everything.
things, yeah.
It's everything.
And we are lucky to live in a city
Yes.
that has a library that has that mission.
Yes, yes, and like even just the summer games are delightful.
Yes,
You know, like,
I got my
you know.
codes.
Yeah, get your codes.
Code by the front door.
Wait,
you-
do we have a code for today?
There sure is. It's over by
What?
the table.
We have
over
a
there.
code for the what? Okay, this just got super exciting, everyone. That there's a code. Maybe you could win one of these. From the shop.
No promises of that.
Okay, because these are some premium water
know,
bottles.
this is
Thank you
this-
alone for the water bottles. But yes, thank you all again. Yes, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
Round
yes.
of applause. Thank you.
And you know, as always, I do want to shout out. There's so many events at the library. Like, there's my friends from Chicago, Trace Play, are doing this AI interactive movement thing tomorrow at 6:00 in this room, and it'll be there's gonna be performance with AI, like motion tracking and everything. And like, what library would have this and then that? Come on, it's awesome.
That's awesome.
So yeah, thank you all again.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Time is out. Woo!